The Grand Aurora Hall had always been the kind of place that could make a person feel small. Its soaring ceilings, adorned with gold leaf trim, seemed to watch over everyone with a kind of ancient judgment. Every inch of the place radiated wealth: crystal chandeliers that dripped light like liquid diamonds, polished marble floors that reflected everything above them, and velvet curtains that whispered luxury when they swayed. It wasn't a building, really, it was a stage, and everyone who entered became part of its performance. Luis Alvarez had been part of that performance for nearly 8 years, though not in a way that anyone noticed. His was the quiet role, the kind played by invisible hands. He arrived each evening just as the last daylight slid off the gilded cornices outside, pushing his mop and bucket along silent corridors, dusting corners no one looked at, and wiping fingerprints off doors before they became permanent. The hall's regular staff barely acknowledged him, most of the patrons didn't even realize someone like him existed. Tonight, the hall was busier than usual. It wasn't a concert night, but something more exclusive, a private audition for the city's most prestigious charity gala, scheduled for the following weekend. Luis had heard rumors for weeks. Only one pianist would be chosen to open the event, and the competition was fierce. The person who secured that spot would be performing not just in front of wealthy donors but also in front of television cameras, politicians, and the kind of people who could turn an artist into an overnight sensation. As Luis mopped the main corridor, he heard the faint sound of a piano drifting from the rehearsal room. He'd been hearing bits of music all evening, scales, warm-ups, the occasional burst of something beautiful, but this time, the music stopped abruptly, and a sharp voice cut through the air. "This isn't a high school recital," the voice said, clipped and cold. "If you can't play Bruch with feeling, you don't belong here." Luis frowned and slowed his steps. He recognized the voice instantly. Marissa Ellington, CEO of Ellington Industries. She wasn't just one of the gala's major sponsors, she was the kind of woman people lowered their voices around. He'd seen her at the hall before, tall, immaculately dressed, the sort of person whose perfume reached you before her words did. She had a reputation for being as precise and unforgiving as a diamond cutter. He edged closer to the open rehearsal room door, careful to stay out of sight. Inside, he saw a young woman sitting stiffly at the Steinway Grand, her hands still resting on the keys, her cheeks flushed with humiliation. A small group of assistants and event coordinators stood off to the side, watching Marissa as if waiting for their cues. Marissa waved a manicured hand dismissively. "Next," she said, not even looking at the pianist as the young woman gathered her sheet music and hurried out. The next hopeful, a nervous young man, stepped forward. He began to play, but within seconds, Marissa raised a hand to stop him. "No, no, no," she said with a sigh that suggested she'd been disappointed for hours. "You're counting the notes. Bruch is not a list to be checked off, it's a confession. If you can't confess, you can't play it." Luis felt an old ache stir somewhere deep inside him. Bruch. He hadn't thought about those pieces in years. The young man stumbled through an apology and left the bench. The assistants avoided looking directly at him as he walked out, shoulders hunched. Marissa turned away from the piano, scanning the room as if searching for her next victim. That was when her gaze swept across the doorway and landed on Luis. He was still holding the mop handle, his dark work shirt slightly damp at the collar from the evening's labor. For a second, their eyes met, and he thought she might just look past him. Instead, she tilted her head, a faint smirk pulling at the corners of her mouth. "Even the janitor probably thinks he could do better," she said, her voice carrying enough for everyone to hear. The assistants laughed politely, too politely, the way people laugh when they don't actually think something is funny but know they're supposed to. Luis's ears burned. He didn't say anything. He rarely did in situations like this. Confrontation wasn't in his job description. He simply lowered his gaze and began to turn away. But then Marissa added, almost playfully, "Tell you what, if you can play Bruch flawlessly, the hall is yours for the night." The laughter grew a little louder. To them, it was a harmless joke, a way to break the tension after a string of disappointing auditions. Luis kept his face expressionless, but the words landed with more weight than anyone in that room realized. "The hall is yours for the night." He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod before continuing down the corridor. Behind him, Marissa's voice resumed its crisp critiques, the sound fading as he turned the corner. By the time he reached the supply closet, the echo of her challenge was still with him. Most nights, when the work was done, he would simply go home, eat something simple, and sleep. But tonight, An idea had begun to grow, quiet, stubborn, and impossible to ignore. It had been over 15 years since he'd last touched a piano in any serious way, but he still remembered the first time he heard Bruch played live. He had been 17, sitting in the back row of a small recital hall in his hometown. The piece had made him feel as if the walls had melted away, as if the air itself was vibrating with emotion. He'd gone home that night and spent hours at the family's old upright, trying to capture even a fraction of that sound. Now, standing alone in the supply closet with the mop water still sloshing in its bucket, Luis realized he could still hear the melody in his mind, clear and unbroken. It was as if it had been waiting all these years for someone to call it back. He finished his shift in silence, but his hands itched with a memory he couldn't shake, the feel of ivory keys under his fingers, the swell of sound blooming in his chest. And for the first time in years, he found himself wondering what would happen if he tried. Luis didn't usually linger after his shift. The Grand Aurora Hall emptied out fast once the rehearsals ended and the administrative offices closed for the night, leaving only the echo of its own grandeur behind. By 10 o'clock, the chandeliers were dimmed, the stage lights shut off, and the last of the security guards made their rounds. Most nights, he liked the silence. It was a quiet reminder that even the most important places became ordinary once the crowds left. But tonight, he couldn't quite bring himself to leave. The words from earlier, Marissa Ellington's smirk, the laughter of her assistants, still pulsed in his mind. The challenge had been tossed out carelessly, meant to amuse, not to be taken seriously. Still, it had stuck to him like dust clinging to polished marble. He wandered into the main hall, his mop bucket abandoned in the supply closet. The massive Steinway grand sat at the center of the stage, its black lacquer gleaming faintly in the low light. Usually, he wouldn't even think of touching it. The piano was treated almost like a sacred object here, tuned daily, cleaned by professionals, handled only by trained technicians or invited musicians. He'd mopped around it hundreds of times without letting his fingers so much as graze its surface. Tonight was different. He stepped onto the stage, feeling the hollow thump of his footsteps beneath the floorboards. When he reached the piano, he stopped, his reflection dimly visible in its polished curve. He reached out slowly, resting his fingertips on the cool lid before lifting it, careful not to let it slam. The smell of the wood and polish rose up, faint but familiar. The last time he had sat at a piano like this, he'd been half a world away. It was a lifetime ago, before the war, before the journey across borders, before he traded music for whatever jobs would keep him alive. He'd been someone else then, someone who had believed talent alone could shape a life. His hands hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. He pressed one, just a single note, and the sound filled the hall, rich and resonant. It wasn't just a sound, it was a memory wrapped in warmth. He pressed another note, and soon they began to form a shape. The opening chords of Bruch's Adagio came to him almost unbidden. His fingers stumbled at first, the years of disuse making themselves known. The timing was off, the dynamics uneven. He paused, took a slow breath, and began again. This time, the music flowed more easily. Muscle memory, buried under years of cleaning floors and emptying trash bins, started to rise. His left hand found the deep, steady anchor of the accompaniment, while his right traced the lyrical lines, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. The hall responded to him. Every note seemed to stretch outward and upward, climbing the gilded walls until it vanished into the shadows near the ceiling. He played quietly at first, testing himself, afraid of shattering whatever fragile connection he'd just rediscovered. But as the phrases unfolded, his touch grew surer. He wasn't just playing Bruch, he was remembering the boy who used to practice until his fingers ached, the young man who dreamed of conservatories and competitions, the artist who believed that music could explain the parts of himself words never could. The years in between came flooding back, too, the night the soldiers arrived, the hurried packing, the train rides and border checks, the endless waiting in lines for papers that never seemed to arrive. Music had no place in that life. The last time he'd tried to play, the sound had felt hollow, like a voice cracking under the weight of grief. He'd closed the lid and walked away, thinking it would be forever. Now, as he sat in the empty grandeur of the Grand Aurora Hall, he realized the music had never left him. It had simply been waiting for a reason to come back. He was so lost in the playing that he didn't hear the soft click of heels against the marble floor behind him. In the dim light at the back of the hall, Marissa Ellington had returned to collect a designer handbag she'd left in her private box. She stopped mid-step when she heard the sound. From her vantage point, she could see Luis only in silhouette, the bent shoulders, the steady hands, the way he seemed to lean into the keys as though listening to something far away. She recognized the piece instantly. It was Bruch, but not the way she was used to hearing it from the young, ambitious pianists who auditioned earlier. There was something raw in his phrasing, something that made the music feel as though it had lived a life before arriving here tonight. Marissa's eyes narrowed slightly. She had heard technical perfection before. It was what most auditions delivered in abundance. But this was not perfection. It was something far rarer, honesty. She stood there, her fingers still curled loosely around the strap of her handbag, and for the first time in months, she didn't think about schedules, sponsorship deals, or donor tables. She just listened. Luis didn't see her, and she didn't announce herself. The piece swelled into its final measures, the last notes lingering in the vast space, soft but unshakable. When the sound faded completely, Luis let his hands fall into his lap. He stared at the keys for a long moment before lowering the lid with quiet reverence. He didn't know if he'd done it justice. He only knew that for the first time in years, he had felt like himself again. Without a word, Marissa turned and left the hall. She didn't even glance back. Luis rose from the bench, the silence around him almost as loud as the music had been. He left the stage slowly, unsure what had compelled him to play in the first place. But deep inside, he felt something shift. The challenge, once just a careless remark, now felt like a promise. Tomorrow, he decided, he would come back earlier. And maybe, just maybe, he would play again. Luis was midway through scrubbing the marble tiles in the west corridor when a shadow fell across him. He looked up to see Marissa Ellington's assistant standing there, a tall, precise-looking woman in a navy suit who always moved as if she were late for something. She held out an envelope with both hands, her expression unreadable. "This is for you," she said simply. Luis wiped his damp palms on his work trousers before taking it. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and stamped with the Grand Aurora Hall's gold crest. His name, his full name, Luis Alejandro Alvarez, was written in neat, looping calligraphy across the front. That alone gave him pause. Hardly anyone here even knew his full name. When he opened it, he almost didn't believe what he was reading. It was a formal invitation to perform as a special guest at the charity gala's opening night. No explanation, no mention of his job. Just his name, the date, the time, and the word, performer, printed in elegant type. He looked up at the assistant. "Is this some kind of mistake?" She shook her head. "It's not a mistake." Her eyes flickered with something. Was it curiosity? Amusement? Pity? He couldn't tell. "You'll be contacted about rehearsal times. Congratulations." And then she was gone, her heels clicking briskly down the hall. Luis stood there, staring at the paper in his hands as if it might vanish. The logical part of his mind told him this was absurd. A janitor, invited to play in front of the city's most powerful and critical audience. No one would take him seriously. But another part of him, quieter, older, whispered that this might be the only chance he'd ever get to step back into the life he'd left behind. The days leading up to the gala passed in a blur. He finished his shifts, then stayed late at the hall, practicing whenever he could slip onto the stage unseen. The first night, he'd been nervous to even touch the piano again. By the third night, his fingers were finding their way across the keys with more surety, the hesitation smoothing out, the music settling into his bones. On the evening of the gala, the hall transformed. Velvet ropes lined the entrance, photographers jostled for the perfect shot as black cars deposited their passengers onto the red carpet. Inside, waiters in white gloves carried trays of champagne. The chandeliers blazed brighter than he had ever seen them, scattering light across the sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. Luis had been given a dark suit for the occasion, borrowed from the hall's costume department, though it fit surprisingly well. He waited backstage, his hands folded to keep them from shaking. Through the heavy curtain, he could hear the murmur of the crowd, the occasional burst of laughter, the metallic clink of glasses. He recognized voices, famous ones, actors, politicians, people whose faces were printed on magazine covers. An event coordinator leaned in through the side door. "You're on in 5. His throat tightened. He had played in front of audiences before, years ago, but never in a setting like this, never with so much at stake. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply until the pounding in his chest slowed just enough to keep moving. When he stepped onto the stage, the light hit him like a wave, warm, blinding. Conversations quieted, the rustle of fabric and glassware fading until only the soft hum of the hall's ventilation filled the space. Somewhere in the front row, Marissa Ellington sat with her legs crossed, her gaze fixed on him. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence felt like both a challenge and an unspoken acknowledgement. Luis sat at the Steinway, the polished keys gleaming like they had been waiting for him. He placed his hands lightly on the keyboard and, for a moment, didn't play at all. The silence stretched, drawing the audience in. Then, softly, he began. The first notes of Bruch's adagio flowed into the air, slow and deliberate, like water finding its way back to a familiar riverbed. The hall seemed to breathe with the music, each phrase expanded and curled upward into the vaulted ceiling. His hands moved instinctively, but not mechanically, every note carried the weight of something lived. The rise and fall of the melody was not just Bruch's, but his own story woven into it, the loss, the years of silence, the endurance that had kept him going when there was nothing else. He forgot about the audience. He forgot about the stage. It was just him and the piano, the music unfolding like a confession he'd been holding back for too long. When the final chord came, he let it linger in the air, letting the last vibrations dissolve into the hush of the hall. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the applause erupted, sudden, thunderous, rising to a standing ovation. The sound filled him, a rush of warmth and disbelief that made his vision blur. He stood, bowing once, then again. Somewhere in the applause, he thought he heard someone call his name. As he looked out over the crowd, he saw faces lit with something he hadn't expected, not just admiration, but something gentler. Respect. Backstage, as he stepped down from the platform, his legs felt unsteady. He wasn't sure if it was from the performance or the flood of adrenaline. The event coordinator clapped him on the shoulder. "That was, I don't even have words," he said. "They loved you out there." Luis nodded, but he couldn't speak yet. He had come here tonight prepared for polite applause at best, dismissal at worst. What he had received instead was something far more dangerous, possibility. And somewhere in the front of the hall, Marissa Ellington had been watching every note. The applause still echoed in Luis's ears when the house lights dimmed again for the next portion of the gala. He was backstage, standing in the narrow space between velvet curtains and the cold plaster wall, trying to steady his breathing. His palms were still warm from the keys, his fingertips tingling as if the notes were still moving through them. He wasn't supposed to go back out there. Performers usually slipped away after their set, making space for the next act. He had started toward the small exit at stage left when a voice stopped him. "Stay," Marissa Ellington said. She was suddenly there, framed in the glow spilling from the stage, her black evening gown catching faint glimmers from the chandeliers. She had an unhurried way of moving now, different from the brisk, commanding presence he'd seen in the rehearsal room. It was as though she had been softened somehow, though her poise remained intact. "I was just leaving," he said. Her lips curved faintly. "Not yet." She stepped closer, her perfume mingling with the faint scent of polish from the Steinway. "I made you a promise, Mr. Alvarez, and I believe tonight you've more than earned it." Before he could reply, she turned toward the stage. The gala host was in the middle of thanking the evening's sponsors, and when he noticed Marissa step forward, he paused. She took the microphone from his hand with a smooth confidence that made the crowd fall instantly silent. "I'm going to interrupt the schedule for a moment," she said. Her voice carried clearly across the hall, no trace of hesitation. "Because there's something I need to acknowledge publicly." The spotlight shifted, catching Luis at the edge of the stage. Instinctively, he froze. "2 nights ago," Marissa continued, "I made a comment. I said that unless you could play Bruch with feeling, you didn't belong on this stage. I even made that comment to the man who cleans this very hall, believing it to be harmless." A ripple of murmurs moved through the audience. Luis felt the heat rise in his face, but Marissa's gaze didn't waver. "I was wrong," she said simply. The words landed with an unexpected weight. Tonight, Luis Alvarez showed all of us what it means to play with feeling. He reminded me, and I think he reminded this hall, why music matters. Not because it's perfect, but because it's honest. She turned toward him then, gesturing for him to step into the light. He hesitated, but something in her expression told him it wasn't optional. Slowly, he walked forward, the brightness of the spotlight making it hard to see the faces in the crowd. When he reached her side, Marissa looked at him in a way that felt both appraising and deeply human. "The hall is yours for the night," she said, Her earlier words returned but stripped of their mockery. And more than that, if you're willing, I'd like to offer you something else. Luis waited, not trusting his voice. I'm organizing a new concert series, she went on. A series that showcases extraordinary talent from unexpected places. I want you to be the headliner for our opening season. The murmur in the hall deepened. Surprise, approval, even excitement. Luis's mouth felt dry. Why me? He asked quietly, though the microphone carried the words to every ear. Marissa's smile didn't falter. Because you didn't just play Bruch. You lived it, and you made us live it with you. She glanced at the audience. How many of us can say that? The crowd responded with applause again, warmer this time, less about performance and more about recognition. Luis stood there, trying to process the moment. Only a week ago, he had been invisible here, just another figure in the background. Tonight, people were looking at him as though he'd been part of this place all along. When the applause finally faded, Marissa leaned closer so only he could hear. Think about it, I'll have my office contact you tomorrow. Then she stepped back, signaling for the evening's program to resume. Backstage again, Luis found a quiet corner and sat down. The adrenaline that had carried him through the night was fading, replaced by a strange stillness. He thought about the years between this moment and the last time he believed music could be part of his life. Years of working just to survive, of pushing the piano into the farthest corner of his mind. He thought, too, of what it had felt like to play tonight, the way the notes had come alive beneath his hands, the way the hall had seemed to lean in closer with each measure. He realized he didn't just want to play again. He needed to. When he finally left the hall that night, it was nearly midnight. The streets were quiet, the air cool against his skin. He walked past the front steps where earlier in the evening, the city's elite had swept inside under flashing cameras. Now, the building loomed in silence, its windows reflecting the streetlights. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at it. For years, this place had been a workplace, nothing more, a place he passed through while unseen. Tonight, it had been something else entirely. Tonight, for a few brief minutes, it had been his. And somewhere deep in his chest, where music and memory had been waiting all this time, something told him this was only the beginning.